Assalamu alaikum. This is Hena Zuberi, and you're watching Muslim Network News. Our top story tonight is about the condo building collapse in Miami. Questions mount on Monday on how a residential building in the Miami area could have collapsed so quickly and so violently last week. The death toll from the disaster has risen to 11, with 150 still unaccounted for. Experts are looking at possible pre-existing serious flaws in the structure of the apartment tower in Surfside near Miami Beach. Rescue teams from Florida and abroad continue to scour the debris for signs of life. This was amid soaring heat and high levels of humidity. But as the hours dragged on and the outlook grew increasingly grim, President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden traveled to Surfside, Florida on Thursday. The White House announced this on Tuesday. To talk about this in detail, a forensic structural engineer is joining us later tonight in our show, so keep watching Muslim Network News. 4 American Muslim charities are among the 286 selected to receive a general donation from the U.S. philanthropist Mackenzie Scott. Scott has been giving away $2.86 billion in donations to various nonprofits. She said that the 4 Muslim organizations were selected because their empowering voices of the world needs to hear. She said the 4 Muslim organizations were selected because their empowering voices the world needs to hear. She says her money will go towards bridging divides that lead to discrimination against ethnic and religious minorities. Each of the 286 charities will receive $10 million. Amongst the Muslim recipients is the Inner City Muslim Action Network, IMAN, a community organization based in Chicago, Muslim Advocates, which recently filed a lawsuit on Facebook for spreading hate against Muslims, is also included. Another charity included was Jusur, which is dedicated to providing educational and entrepreneurship opportunities to young Syrians. The Chicago-based Pillars Fund was also selected. Scott is the ex-wife of Amazon boss Jeff Bezos. President Joe Biden has appointed Ismail Ahmed as a member of the National Council of the Arts. The council advises the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts on agency policies and programs. It also reviews and makes recommendations to the chairman on applications for grants, funding guidelines, and leadership initiatives. Ahmed most recently served as the Associate Provost for the Metropolitan Impact at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Prior to that, he served as the Director of Michigan's Department of Human Services, the state's second largest department. He co-founded the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services in 1971. Under his leadership, it has grown into a national human services and advocacy agency with affiliates in 24 cities. He's also the co-founder of the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn and serves as an executive member of its advisory board. Since 1984, he has led Detroit's Concert of Colors, which was one of the largest world music festivals in the United States. Ahmed also produces and hosts the multicultural music and arts program, This Island Earth, on Detroit Public Radio. Rockets have allegedly been fired at a U.S. military base in eastern Syria on the border of Iraq. Footage from Syrian state news agency Sana shows the attack at the Al Omar oil field in the Deir Ozor province. Sana did not say who was behind the rocket fire. However, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights blamed it on pro-Iranian militia. The development came less than 24 hours after the U.S. launched airstrikes against 3 targets. It said they were used by pro-Iran groups in eastern Syria and western Iraq. Kataib Hezbollah and Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada are the 2 Iraqi Shia armed factions. They were amongst the several Iran-backed militia groups that used the facilities, the Pentagon claimed. There have been repeated attacks in the recent months against U.S. interests in Iraq. the U.S. Central Command released aerial footage showing U.S. strikes on 3 positions along the Syrian-Iraq border. This sparked immediate calls for revenge and fears of a new escalation between Washington and Tehran. Here is Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State.
This action in self-defense to do what's necessary to prevent further attacks, I think sends a very important and strong message, and I hope very much that it is received by those who are intended to receive it.
Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan has released science-based coronavirus guidelines, a reversal from her predecessor. She has also placed an order for coronavirus vaccines. The former president, John Magufuli, denied the existence of the deadly COVID-19 virus and is suspected of dying from it. His successor, Samia Suluhu Hassan, has opened several COVID-19 testing centers. Suluhu Hassan is the first Muslim woman head of state in modern Africa. The country of nearly 60 million people was one of the last and the most prominent African nations to shun the COVID-19 vaccinations. Burundi and Eritrea are now the only holdouts of the continent. Meanwhile, South Africa has become the 3rd country worldwide forcing a new strict lockdown due to the Delta variant of the COVID-19 virus, which originated in India. On Monday, Bangladesh announced a complete shutdown of the country due to the same variant. Chinese President Xi Jinping led the applause at the Beijing Bird Nest Stadium last Monday. It was a spectacular celebration of Communist Party history. The event came before the July 1st centenary of the party that has shaped the modern history of China. In 100 years, the country has developed from a war-torn, impoverished nation to an economic and political superpower. The extravagant show included big screen dedications to key leaders from Mao to Xi Jinping, accompanied by the blare of 100 trumpets. It also included greetings from a group of Chinese astronauts currently in space. And just as July 4th celebrations in the United States rarely referred to the plight of Native Americans, the celebrations omitted negative chapters of China's history. Those include the famine that killed millions in the 1950s, the purges of the Cultural Revolution, and the crackdown on student protesters in Tiananmen Square in 1989. There was also no mention of the largest concentration camps since the Nazis, detaining over 1 million Uyghurs. Instead, performers triumphantly punched fists in the air, danced, and gave a theatrical retelling of party highlights. A special dedication was given to China's defeat of COVID-19 with performers in PPE and soldiers wearing masks. Xi Jinping has carefully reframed the pandemic, which emerged in the central Chinese city of Wuhan. He claims it as a victory for the party organization and Chinese resilience under his watch. Meanwhile, leaders of China and Russia announced the extension of a 20-year-old friendship treaty. They hailed increasingly close ties and stabilizing role of their relationship. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping held a televised meeting by video link. Russian military instructors in the Central African Republic have carried out indiscriminate killings and other war crimes. A report by experts to the UN Security Council accused them of looting as well. The testimonies detailed excessive force which amount to violations of international humanitarian law. The Central African Republic is amongst the 10 poorest countries in the world. The Central African Republic is amongst the 10 poorest countries in the world. It is rich in minerals and has been in the grip of civil war since 2013. The Central African Republic's president, Faustin Archange Touadéra, is backed by Russia. However, he continues to face resistance from rebel forces linked to former President François Bozize. The French military controlled the country from 2013 to 2016. It was the 7th French military intervention there since its independence in 1960. During French operations, almost all of the 436 mosques in the Central African Republic were destroyed by Christian militias supported by the French military. A tree in the Amazon rainforest has become a game changer in the fight against greenhouse gas emissions and the push for sustainable farming practices. Inga or chimbio is a small tropical, tough-leaved nitrogen-fixing tree. It's native to the Amazon, but it's also found in other Central and South American countries. This tree is allowing rural farmers to practice regenerative farming methods. It's replacing the land clearance model, which tends to yield only one good crop. The tree also cuts down on dangerous emissions. About 250 million farmers worldwide are estimated to practice slash and burn method of land clearing agriculture. This releases carbon, thereby contributing to 73% of greenhouse gas emissions from the developing world's agriculture. The Inga tree grows to 25 feet in the first year of its life. It's tolerant to poor soil conditions, heat, drought, and flooding. So far, the methods of Inga alley cropping have been adopted by farmers in 16 countries, including the tropics of Africa. Use of the tree in agriculture this way has been pioneered by Dr. Mike Hands, a British surveyor in Honduras. As a mother, I wonder how mothers of Native children felt when their children were snatched away from them and from the First Nations in Canada and Indigenous tribes in the United States. In the name of education, to civilize them. And now we find their remains in shallow graves. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saliha Farouk.
These green fields are deceiving. Hidden beneath the dirt are children who could not flower. Snatched away from their parents, they died alone. The parents possibly did not know that they died. Even now, the churches are not letting us see records of these Indigenous children. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has asked the Pope to apologize. This came after the discovery of a second burial site with 751 unmarked graves of Indigenous people.
We are sorry. It was something that we cannot undo in the past, but we can pledge ourselves every day to fix in the present and into the future. And that means recognizing the harms, the impacts, the intergenerational trauma.
While Canada is lowering its flags to mourn these children, America is just waking up. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland announced an initiative to mine records of residential schools forced upon Native Americans. She herself is the first Native person to lead the U.S. Department of Interior. It will search for possible burial sites of hundreds of thousands of Native American children. These discoveries could shed some light on more than 150 years of genocide on the indigenous peoples of North America. These residential schools in America lasted from 1819 to 1969. These schools were first established by Christian missionaries to Christianize children. Later, the U.S. government started funding them. The primary objective of these schools was quote-unquote civilizing Native American children. This essentially meant cutting them off from the Native American culture and assimilating them into white European culture. Multiple investigations have revealed that these schools were usually harsh and sometimes deadly. Investigators found sexual, physical, and mental abuse occurring in these church-run schools. The 1928 Merriam Report noted that the death rates for Native American students were 6.5 times higher than for others. Infectious diseases killed Native children at the schools due to malnutrition, overcrowding, and poor sanitary conditions. While politicians still search for graves of those children now, their mothers will never know what happened to their children.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. A string of anti-Muslim attacks have revealed the growing problem of Islamophobia in Canada. Hate crime researcher Irfan Chaudhry said anti-Muslim attacks have increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. He's joining Saleha Farouk for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Saleha.
Thank you so much. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Irfan Chaudhry, who is the Director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity, and Equity. Irfan, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
Our pleasure. Now, the province of Ontario has just recently granted around $300,000 to a couple of Muslim organizations just for the purpose of fighting Islamophobia in schools. Now, when it comes to increased tolerance and understanding, how important are such diversity programs within educational institutes in your professional opinion? And will this make a difference?
No, it's a good question. I think the funding is important, but I always have that with a caveat of it has to be sustainable and it has to be consistent. And so often what you see with these types of funding programs, there might be on 1 to 3 year cycles, and that's where it really has the gap in a broader impact, I would say, because often these programs, educational related, awareness related, they get, funding at the beginning. And then when things really amp up in terms of awareness and people being able to connect to these types of funding and educational opportunities, funding is now not available and these projects just disappear. So I think the funding is always a good start, but it needs to be sustainable. It needs to be long term.
Now, with a string of recent Islamophobic attacks across the country, which we can trace back to the 2017 Quebec City mosque shooting, as well as the Muslim man in Toronto that was shot outside of a mosque just last year, do you believe that Islamophobia is a real issue in Canada and Ontario?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers, as we're kind of being more aware of them, are unfortunately speaking for themselves. Even before the Quebec mosque shooting, there was a number of, smaller related, incidents in and around Muslim communities across Canada. But now we're seeing more visibility in terms of the levels and layers of violence, right? And the unfortunate, crime that happened in London a few weeks back. To me, that would have been a tipping point. Quebec mosque actually, for me, would have been a tipping point around just the impact of Islamophobia in Canada. But then what we saw with London, it kind of highlights it's still a key consideration. And what's really unfortunate is how it still continues even after such a horrific event that we saw a few weeks back. Because people, in Edmonton, for example, 2 Muslim women last week were attacked at knife point wearing the hijab in a public space. And so these things still continue. And I think there needs to be more of a elevated discourse and awareness of just the impact of how people might have misconceptions about the community that go unchallenged. Well, now we're seeing them being amplified in negative ways in offline spaces.
Now, where do you believe that this anti-Muslim violence and sentiment in Canada is emanating from?
In some of the work I've done on researching, hateful content on social media platforms, that's the easy starting point, especially how we've been, engaging online for the last year and a bit because of COVID. A lot of our lives have shifted, almost 100% online in terms of social interactions. But I think what becomes more problematic is it's not the overt, sentiment that's impactful, because most social media platforms now are able to kind of take away or remove some of the overtly hateful content. It's the subtle stuff, right? It's the things where people say, well, don't come to our country, we can't adapt, different tropes like that. Even though many Muslims in Canada have been here for generations and generations, you still have this very strong dynamic of othering the Muslim community in Canada, and it's really amplified on social media through the sharing of memes, through the sharing of misinformation, through the sharing of uneducated assumptions related to the community and a fear of Sharia law coming into Canada. And I think all these types of misinformed frames of references are able to really scare individuals that don't have an awareness or a broader scope of the world, and feeds into their ignorance, if we be quite bold. And then we're seeing some acting out in very violent, negative ways. And so I think there's been an amplification of the anti-Muslim narrative online, just in the context of COVID, but also in the context of what we're seeing in Canada. No racialized group has been left untouched in terms of discrimination in a COVID era, right? If you just look at it the last year and a bit, almost every racialized group has been impacted in a negative way because of stereotypes, because of violence, because of discrimination. And I don't know, and they're still early on in obviously our understanding of the COVID impact on these social interactions, but it's something really to be mindful of, that, it's being something like racial violence has been impacting all communities in Canada. And that's something really, really to pay attention to.
A lot of talk recently on countering the hate through legislation, and community level organizations of all kinds and sizes are planning things like roundtables and summits to help inform the government of such human rights recommendations from their end. However, do you believe that this will play a role in shaping anti-Islamophobia legislation, keeping in mind the perceived failures of Bill 21?
I'll be optimistic on this, but I'm also hesitant in the sense of, even a couple years back when M103 was being put forward, and the only thing it was asking was for, members of parliament to condemn Islamophobia. And still there was a lot of resistance to that in terms of just even condemning it because of people feeling it was, playing identity politics. And so I think, we'll see how we are now, fast forward from the Quebec mosque shooting, fast forward from the attack in London, Ontario. I'm really interested to see how this, national summit comes together and what real meaningful change will come. But I'm not sure, because all these things always depend on political cycles, right? So in the event there's a federal election happening, how might that impact any traction the summit has? In our province, both major cities, Edmonton and Calgary, will be going through municipal elections in October. And so seeing a lot of political candidates at the municipal level even highlighting platforms to address hate at the local level. But again, until we see the action, it's always going to just be words. And so I think that's where I'm hopeful we see more concentrated efforts, but it's more, proof is in the pudding in terms of how we understand this.
A lot of people are looking at the rhetoric of certain political leaders in Canada and how they have just spoken about Muslim rights over the years and how that might have contributed to this general Islamophobic sentiment or atmosphere that's been culminating until now. Do you believe that Canadian leaders have a responsibility to practice what they preach in order to increase understanding and tolerance in society?
100%, right? I think when you look at it, even in 2015, when the Conservative Party put together that barbaric cultural practices hotline, that single-handedly, put Muslim Canadians on the spot in terms of being perceived as a barbaric culture, that has long-term ramifications, right? You'll still see some of those information pamphlets and posters circulating online that really, again, fuel this fire. And so if some of these political leaders have had a growth experience and are learning that their position or their stance or their statements in previous years has really been negative and has impacted the community in a very, very harmful way, yes, acknowledgement is step one, but step two is, what are you going to do about it? Because right now what I'm observing is a lot of people in these positions of power have no idea what to do. And I think that's really concerning, because you have a lot of people in the community across Canada looking at political leaders to see what will you do. And there's a big question mark in terms of what can be done. And I don't know if anyone has the appetite to really go down a path that this needs to go down in terms of looking at our hate crime legislation, challenging some of the freedom of expression pieces that people are able to get, away with some of this hateful content. And so I think these are the conversations we need to start to open up, and not saying we want to take away, our rights and freedoms that all of us have, but I think we need to take a second look, because if our laws right now and legislation right now are incredibly weak to help us deal with some of these nuances that aren't overtly connected to hate crime, criminal code categories, we need more. And I think that's what I'm not seeing in terms of the appetite for people to have this type of dialogue.
We wanted to be advantageous of your presence today and ask you, when it comes to recommendations, what do you think that the federal government needs to do to help curb anti-Muslim hatred and violence in Canada?
Yeah, I think one starting point, again, I always know how long it takes to change legislation, but our hate crime legislation has not been looked at in this country since the 1990s. And so I think there's time to just, look under the hood, look at the language, look if there's any additions. In 1990, there was a section that was added under sentencing principles to consider hate and bias as a motive. And that's broad and applicable, but we also don't have some language around some of those nuances. And I think when we put that lack of direction in our legislation and leave it to the discretion of individual police services to administer that, it becomes very inconsistent, because one officer might deal with something in a completely opposite way than another officer, still the same type of file, let's say, but because that discretion is there for them to adapt how they choose, that's where you have inconsistency. So that'd be number one. Number two, we need more formalized hate crime training for law enforcement across Canada. Right now, it's done very inconsistently. Right now, most hate crime units tend to be under-resourced. And so I would argue, in addition to training, resourcing more of these units so we have that better capacity from an enforcement perspective, while at the same time trying to build capacity at the systemic perspective. And that's the one that's going to take a lot of time to address.
Some great insight there. We're here with Irfan Chowdhury, who is Director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity, and Equity. Thank you so much, Irfan, for your valuable time today.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Back to Hena Zuberi in the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. Coverage of the building collapsing in Miami, Florida continues as we move to our next analysis segment. A forensic structural engineer is joining Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. Miami tragedy continues every day with hope that some good news will come out. But lately, just one more person not alive came out. What is going on? Why it happened? And how more lives could be saved? To discuss with us, a person who is a forensic structural engineer himself, and he's president of SEP Engineers. Welcome, Joel Villans.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So tell us, Joel, why it is taking so long to rescue people?
That's a great question, and I'm sure it's a question that's on everyone's mind. So when a building collapses, such as this one here, you have what is essentially a second structure that forms at the base of the collapse. So the debris is actually another structure. So when those guys are out there trying to save lives, they also have to be really careful that when they remove the debris, they remove it in such a way that minimizes any shifting or displacement of the debris itself.
So what about those huge cranes which we see on construction sites? If they are installed on all the site and things are lifted gently from above, because there are so many people who are still buried there, and I hope they're alive.
I hope so as well. And yes, I think there are a couple of cranes there now. One of the challenges with removing larger pieces of debris is when you remove a larger piece, there is a greater chance of shifting or displacing of that debris. So I'm sure that they're working as quickly as possible, but also don't want to jeopardize or worsen the situation by causing a shift in the debris that exists there right now.
So, you being a structural engineer and at the top of his forensic, what are the chances that people somehow, somewhere, are still alive?
There's always hope. When a structure collapses in and of itself, as this one did, if you look at the video, there was a fairly vertical collapse. The columns sort of intersect themselves between the slabs. So there are some areas where there could potentially be what we call the air gaps between the debris. So there is still hope. At least I'm hopeful that we will find more survivors. But there is always a chance that there could be air gaps in that debris, and that there could still potentially be lives within those air gaps.
And that probably is the reason they are so careful that not lifting debris in a way that it disbalance and another collapse type situation might come, right?
Correct. Correct. Essentially, when you're removing the debris, you want to make sure that if there are those air gaps there, that you don't close them off or you don't displace them while you're trying to remove the debris from off the site.
So from it, we are seeing the news items that it was already known that it has structural problems. Isn't there a code when some engineer determines it has a structural problem that you evacuate the whole thing and fix it first?
It's a little more complicated with condominiums. That there is a 2018 report out there that identified structural issues with the building, particularly of concern in the pool deck area, which also known as the pool podium. It's a little more complex because in a condominium you have the unit owners and you have a board, and the board is part of the association, and that association essentially controls the finances for the building. So in other words, if there's maintenance that needs to be performed, the board will determine how much of that maintenance is, and they would go back to the unit owners and say, okay, the maintenance is X, which means that every residence will be assessed a fee of Y to be able to make these repairs. And of course, if those budgets are either insufficient, or if the condo owners decide, in some cases, they waive those assessments, then obviously some of that maintenance potentially could get deferred or delayed. So we wish it were simple, but with a condominium, there's an association, there's budgets, there's assessments, etc.
So that is sort of internal bureaucracy which delayed that. But report is of 2018. Wasn't that report provided to state of Florida that or the city or the county that this thing has such a major problems?
So when there's a site visit or when there's an investigation, the association will typically hire the engineer directly, and the engineer will supply a report to the association. That's their client. I'm not certain if that report would have made its way into the hands of some of the public agencies or not. Certainly, if there's repair work that's ongoing, there's a permit that gets pulled with the building department, and at that point they would be aware that there's repairs that are being done there. But as far as the report, typically that report gets submitted to the client, and what the client chooses to do with that report is really up to the client.
So building as large as it is, don't you think it should have some type of city or county process of inspection once in a while?
So that's a great question. So there are procedures in place in Miami-Dade County specifically for what is called a 40 years recertification. So essentially, when a building reaches 40 years in age, the county requires that the building undergo a review of the structural elements as well as the electrical components to make sure that there aren't any deficiencies that would cause a life safety issue. And that's typically done again at the 40-year mark of a structure in Miami-Dade County.
Is 40-year structure in these type of buildings, is 40 years some type of a life cycle point? How they determine 40 years? Why not 30 or 50?
It's another good question. So it is based on life cycle, and in certain cases, some engineers, some of us have argued that the life cycle of, say, a structure in the center of the state versus a structure that's in a coastal region would be potentially reduced because the exposure is greater. In other words, if I live in Orlando, Florida versus Miami Beach, in Orlando, Florida, I still get hurricanes, but I don't get as much of the salt spray and the exposure from the ocean in that property versus if I live in Miami Beach, there's a constant exposure to those elements and to that coastal zone.
So do your hypothesis says some of those elements played a role on this building?
We don't want to speculate, but in forensics, there's many contributing factors, and we try to start with many theories and then narrow them down. I would suspect that will be one of the contributing factors that the forensic engineers and the experts that are looking through all of this information will consider. That will definitely be a part of it. Whether it's the sole cause of it is yet to be determined, of course.
You're right now in that area. Are you working on that building?
I am in that area. I am here to meet with a couple of other colleagues that are working in that building. I have not specifically been inside the ground zero area yet. I just arrived here earlier this morning.
So as a forensic engineer, what will be the specific things which you'll be looking for?
Another great question. So forensics is a process just like everything else. Right now, the debris is very important. The positioning of that debris is very important because the debris will tell a story. So as it's being removed, I'm sure that it's also being documented for analysis at a later date. So I would be looking for that. I would also be looking at the vertical face of the structure where the building dismembered from the other tower, and I would be looking for clues there. And lastly, I would be looking at the condition of the materials in the debris. In other words, is the concrete severely worn? Is the reinforcing severely corroded? Of course, if a building collapses, the reinforcing is not going to corrode overnight. So I would be looking for those types of clues to kind of give me an idea of what could potentially be going on or what happened.
Well, thank you so much for your time. At the end, tell me, this forensic, is it a big field in which a lot of people are getting in?
It's not a very big field. There aren't that many of us. There are enough of us, I think. Obviously, when something like this happens, we always wish we had more forensic engineers, but it's a somewhat specialized area. Most structural engineers practice design and inspections. A very few of us get into the forensics area. I guess some of us are even more curious than design. So,
well, thank you so much, Joel Valens, a forensic structural engineer who is right now in the Miami area, president of SEP Engineering. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.